The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished marble floors of Buckingham Palace. As Camilla stepped through the grand entrance, her heels clicked sharply against the stone, echoing through the vast corridors that had witnessed centuries of royal history. She had been summoned for what was supposed to be a routine meeting about upcoming charitable events. But something in the air felt different today. The usual warmth that greeted her seemed replaced by an unusual coldness, and the staff members who passed by offered only brief nods instead of their customary friendly greetings. Camilla had always carried herself with a certain confidence, perhaps too much at times. She had grown accustomed to her position over the years, and with that comfort came a sense of entitlement that occasionally crossed boundaries others dared not approach. Today would prove to be one of those days when her overconfidence would lead her down a path she never anticipated. As she made her way through the palace, she noticed unusual activity. Royal guards stood at attention in positions they normally didn't occupy, and palace staff moved with purpose, whispering among themselves. Something important was happening, though Camilla couldn't quite put her finger on what it might be. She dismissed her concerns, assuming it was merely preparations for some state function she hadn't been fully briefed about. The meeting room she entered was more crowded than expected. Several senior members of the royal household were present, along with advisors whose faces she recognized but whose names escaped her at that moment. At the far end of the ornate table sat Charlotte, the young woman who had recently been confirmed as the future queen. Charlotte was known for her grace, intelligence, and most importantly, her unwavering commitment to royal protocol and dignity. She had earned respect not through birthright alone, but through years of dedicated service and genuine care for the people she would one day serve as their monarch. Camilla had never particularly warmed to Charlotte. Perhaps it was jealousy, or maybe it was the simple fact that Charlotte represented everything Camilla felt she should have been herself. Whatever the reason, their relationship had always been cordial on the surface, but cold underneath, like a frozen lake that looked solid, but cracked under any real pressure. The meeting began with discussions about various royal engagements and charitable initiatives. Charlotte spoke eloquently about a new program to support underprivileged children, her passion evident in every word. Others around the table listened attentively, offering suggestions and support. But Camilla found herself growing increasingly irritated. She felt overshadowed, pushed to the sidelines while Charlotte basked in the attention and approval of those present, unable to contain her frustration any longer. Camilla interrupted Charlotte mid-sentence. The room fell silent immediately, the shock palpable. One simply didn't interrupt the future queen, especially not in such a dismissive manner. But Camilla pressed on, her voice dripping with condescension as she questioned Charlotte's ideas, suggesting they were naive and impractical. She went further, making thinly veiled criticisms about Charlotte's youth and supposed lack of real-world experience. Charlotte remained composed, her face betraying no emotion, even as Camilla's words grew more pointed and disrespectful. The others in the room shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether to intervene or remain silent. The tension in the room became thick enough to cut with a knife, but Camilla wasn't finished. Emboldened by what she mistook as weakness in Charlotte's calm response, she continued her attack. She questioned Charlotte's judgment, her priorities, even her suitability for the role she had been born to fulfill. The words hung in the air like poison, and everyone present understood that Camilla had just crossed a line from which there might be no return. What Camilla failed to notice in her moment of prideful rage was the subtle signal Charlotte gave to one of the senior advisors. She also didn't see the royal guard who had quietly entered the room and now stood near the door, his face impassive, but his attention focused entirely on the unfolding drama. Charlotte finally spoke, her voice steady and clear despite the assault she had just endured. She thanked Camilla for her input, though everyone recognized the diplomatic dismissal for what it was. Then Charlotte did something unexpected. She calmly outlined the ancient protocols regarding respect for the crown and those in line for succession. She spoke of traditions that dated back hundreds of years, rules that had been put in place to protect the dignity of the monarchy and ensure that personal feelings never undermined the institution itself. As Charlotte spoke, The color slowly drained from Camilla's face. She was beginning to realize that her outburst hadn't occurred in a vacuum. This wasn't a private disagreement that could be smoothed over with a half-hearted apology. She had publicly disrespected the future queen in front of witnesses in an official setting. And according to protocols, she had conveniently forgotten or chosen to ignore. Such actions carried serious consequences. The meeting concluded shortly after, with Charlotte maintaining her composure throughout. As people began to file out of the room, the royal guard who had been standing by the door approached Camilla. His face remained expressionless as he quietly asked her to remain behind. Those final words walking out heard the request and exchanged knowing glances. Something significant was about to happen, and the palace grapevine would ensure that everyone knew about it within the hour. Camilla found herself alone in the room, except for the guard and two senior advisors who had also been asked to stay. Her earlier confidence had evaporated completely, replaced by a growing sense of dread. One of the advisors, an elderly man who had served the royal family for over 40 years, looked at her with something resembling pity mixed with disappointment. He began to explain the situation in terms that left no room for misunderstanding. What Camilla had done wasn't simply rude or inappropriate by normal social standards. Under royal protocol, her actions constituted a serious offense against the dignity of the crown. The monarchy had survived for centuries, partly because it maintained strict standards of conduct, especially regarding how members of the royal household treated those in direct line for the throne. Camilla tried to interrupt, to offer explanations or apologies, but she was quietly but firmly told to listen. The advisor continued outlining the historical precedents for such situations. He spoke of cases from decades and even centuries past, where individuals had been severely punished for lesser offenses against royal dignity. While modern sensibilities had softened some of the harsher penalties, the core principles remained unchanged. The royal guard stepped forward and, in a voice devoid of emotion, informed Camilla that she was being placed under formal investigation. The words hit her like physical blows. An investigation meant interviews, documentation, and most terrifying of all, potential legal consequences. She thought of her reputation, her position, and everything she had worked to build over the years. All of it now hung in the balance because of a few minutes of uncontrolled anger and petty jealousy. As the full weight of her situation began to sink in, Camilla realized that she had made a catastrophic mistake. She had allowed her personal feelings to override centuries of protocol, and now she would face the consequences. The guard informed her that she would need to remain available for questioning, and that leaving London without permission would be viewed as an attempt to avoid accountability. The room suddenly felt smaller, the walls closing in. Camilla had entered the palace that morning as a member of the royal household with status and privileges. She would leave under a cloud of disgrace, facing an uncertain future that might include consequences she had never imagined possible. The palace that had been her second home now felt like a trap, and she had walked into it entirely of her own making. Outside the meeting room, palace staff went about their duties. But word of what had happened spread quickly through whispered conversations and meaningful glances. By evening, the entire royal household would know that Camilla had disrespected the future queen, and that the royal guard had become involved. The machinery of royal justice, slow but inexorable, had been set in motion, and there would be no stopping it now. The days following the incident moved with agonizing slowness for Camilla. She had returned to her residence in a state of shock, replaying the scene over and over in her mind. Each time she remembered her words to Charlotte, she felt a fresh wave of regret and fear. How had she allowed herself to lose control so completely? Pride, she realized too late, had been her downfall. That dangerous combination of jealousy and arrogance had pushed her to say things that could never be unsaid. Her phone had been ringing constantly since she arrived home, but she couldn't bring herself to answer most of the calls. Friends and acquaintances from within royal circles had heard whispers of what happened, and they wanted details. Some called out of genuine concern, but others were merely curious, eager for gossip they could share at dinner parties. Camilla ignored them all, sitting in her drawing room and staring at the walls, wondering what would happen next. The formal summons arrived on the third day. A royal messenger delivered it personally, the envelope bearing the official seal that made her stomach turn. Inside, written in formal language that somehow made everything feel more serious, was a notice that she was required to appear before a special tribunal. This wasn't a criminal court in the traditional sense, but rather an internal royal proceeding that would examine her conduct and determine appropriate consequences. According to protocols that governed the royal household, Camilla's hands shook as she read the document. The tribunal would convene in 1 week, giving her time to prepare her defense and secure legal representation. The notice made clear that this was not optional, and failure to appear would result in immediate and severe sanctions. She was also informed that her movements were being monitored and that she was not to attempt contact with Charlotte or any members of the immediate royal family during this period. The isolation was crushing. Camilla had spent years building relationships within royal circles, and now those same circles seemed to be closing against her. Former friends suddenly became unavailable, their assistants politely explaining that they were traveling or indisposed. Invitations to social events were quietly withdrawn. She understood what was happening. People were distancing themselves from her, protecting their own positions by cutting ties with someone who had fallen from grace. She hired a lawyer, an experienced man named Mr. Harrison, who specialized in matters involving the royal household. He had handled sensitive cases before, though he admitted to Camilla during their first meeting that her situation was unusually serious. Public disrespect toward the future queen, particularly in an official setting with witnesses, was not something that could be easily dismissed or explained away. Mr. Harrison spent hours interviewing Camilla, trying to understand exactly what had been said and why. He needed to build some kind of defense, find mitigating circumstances that might reduce whatever punishment the tribunal decided to impose. But as Camilla recounted the incident in detail, even she could hear how weak any potential defense would sound. She had no excuse beyond her own jealousy and poor judgment, and Mr. Harrison's increasingly grave expression told her he knew it too. Meanwhile, Charlotte continued her royal duties with the same grace and composure she had always shown. She attended charity events, met with community leaders, and fulfilled her obligations without ever mentioning the incident publicly. Her silence on the matter was strategic and powerful. By refusing to be drawn into any public discussion about what had happened, she maintained her dignity while allowing the official processes to unfold as they should. But privately, Charlotte struggled with the situation more than anyone knew. She had not wanted this confrontation, had not sought to have Camilla punished. All she had ever wanted was mutual respect and the ability to work together for the good of the institutions they both served. Camilla's attack had been painful not just because of the words themselves, but because it revealed a depth of animosity that Charlotte had hoped didn't exist. Charlotte's advisors had encouraged her to pursue the matter formally. They argued that letting such disrespect go unpunished would set a dangerous precedent, potentially encouraging others to treat her with similar contempt. If she didn't stand firm now, before she even took the throne, her entire reign could be undermined by those who saw her as weak or unwilling to defend the dignity of her position. So Charlotte had agreed, though not without considerable thought and some reluctance. She understood that she wasn't just protecting herself, but the institution of the monarchy itself. Personal feelings had to be set aside in service of something larger than any individual. It was a lesson that had been impressed upon her from childhood, and now she was living it in a way she had never expected. The palace itself seemed different in those days. Staff members went about their work with unusual quiet, as if afraid that speaking too loudly might draw unwanted attention. The upcoming tribunal was the talk of every servant's hall and guard station, though such conversations stopped immediately whenever anyone senior passed by. The royal household was a small community in many ways, and when one of their own faced serious consequences, everyone felt the ripples. Camilla used the days before the tribunal to prepare as best she could. Mr. Harrison coached her on how to present herself, what to say, and more importantly, what not to say. He warned her that contrition would be essential, that any attempt to justify or minimize her actions would likely backfire spectacularly. She needed to accept full responsibility, express genuine remorse, and hope that the tribunal would show some measure of mercy. But preparing her defense was only part of the challenge. Camilla also had to confront herself in ways she never had before. In the quiet hours of the night, when sleep refused to come, she was forced to examine the person she had become. When had she grown so bitter? When had jealousy and resentment taken such deep root in her heart? She had started her royal journey with good intentions, wanting to serve and contribute. Somewhere along the way, she had lost sight of those noble goals, becoming focused instead on status, recognition, and her own perceived importance. The realization was painful but necessary. If she survived this ordeal with her position intact, she would need to change fundamentally. She couldn't continue being the person who had stood in that meeting room and attacked Charlotte with such venom. That person had brought her to the brink of ruin, and continuing down that path would surely destroy whatever remained of her reputation and career. As the day of the tribunal approached, Camilla's anxiety reached new heights. She barely slept, barely ate, her mind constantly cycling through worst-case scenarios. Could they actually imprison her? Mr. Harrison had explained that while imprisonment in the traditional sense was unlikely, there were other forms of confinement and restriction that could be imposed under royal protocols. She could be barred from court, stripped of titles and privileges, essentially exiled from the only life she had known for years. The night before the tribunal, Camilla sat alone in her residence and wrote a letter. It was addressed to Charlotte, though she knew she wasn't supposed to make contact. She wrote it anyway, pouring out her regrets and apologies onto paper. She explained how jealousy had clouded her judgment, how fear of becoming irrelevant had driven her to lash out. She apologized not just for her words, but for the disrespect they represented, for failing to honor Charlotte's position and the sacrifices Charlotte had made in service to the crown. When she finished writing, Camilla sealed the letter and placed it in her desk drawer. She didn't know if she would ever send it, if it would even be allowed. But writing it had provided some small measure of relief, an acknowledgement of truth that she had been avoiding. Whatever happened tomorrow, at least she had admitted to herself the full extent of her mistakes. The morning of the tribunal arrived cold and gray, the weather seeming to mirror Camilla's mood perfectly. She dressed carefully in conservative clothes, avoiding anything that might seem too grand or presumptuous. Mr. Harrison had advised her to look respectful, but not defiant, but contrite, but not pitiful. It was a difficult balance to strike, but she did her best as she prepared to leave for Buckingham Palace. Where the tribunal would take place, Camilla caught her reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back at her looked older than she remembered, worn down by stress and regret. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and headed for the door. Whatever awaited her in that tribunal room, she would face it with whatever dignity she could muster. It was, she thought sadly, the least she could do after having so thoroughly failed to show dignity when it had mattered most. The tribunal room at Buckingham Palace was smaller than Camilla had imagined, which somehow made it feel more intimidating rather than less. It was located in a part of the palace she had rarely visited, corridors that seemed designed to remind anyone walking them of the weight of history and tradition. The walls were lined with portraits of past monarchs and royal figures, their painted eyes seeming to judge her as she passed. Inside the room, 5 senior members of the royal household sat behind a long, mahogany table that gleamed under the soft lighting. These were individuals who had dedicated their entire lives to serving the crown. People who understood protocol and tradition better than almost anyone alive. Their faces were neutral, professional, revealing nothing of what they might be thinking as Camilla entered with Mr. Harrison at her side. The proceedings began with a formal reading of the charges against her. Hearing her actions described in such clinical legal language made them sound even worse than she had imagined. The official terminology: disrespect to the heir apparent, breach of royal protocol, conduct unbecoming of a member of the royal household. Each phrase hit her like a hammer blow. When the reading finished, the chairman of the tribunal, a distinguished gentleman named Lord Pembridge, who had served 3 monarchs during his long career, asked Camilla how she wished to respond to the charges. Mr. Harrison had prepared her for this moment. She stood, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her, and spoke the words they had rehearsed. She acknowledged her actions fully, without excuse or attempt at justification. She admitted that she had allowed personal feelings to override her duty and respect for protocol. Her voice wavered slightly as she spoke. genuine emotion breaking through despite her attempts to remain composed. Then came the testimony of witnesses. Several people who had been present in the meeting room when the incident occurred were called to describe what they had seen and heard. Each account was similar, painting a picture of Camilla's outburst that left little room for interpretation. Some witnesses seemed uncomfortable, clearly not enjoying the position they had been placed in, but they answered the tribunal's questions honestly. The facts were the facts, and there was no way to soften them. What surprised Camilla was when Charlotte herself entered the room. The future queen had not been required to appear, could have simply submitted a written statement, but she had chosen to attend in person. Charlotte sat down in the witness chair with perfect posture, her hands folded calmly in her lap. When asked to describe the incident, she did so without embellishment or emotional coloring. She simply stated what had happened, what had been said, and how she had responded. But then the chairman asked Charlotte a question that changed the entire atmosphere in the room. He asked what outcome she wished to see from these proceedings. Charlotte paused for a moment, her gaze briefly meeting Camilla's across the room. When she spoke, her words were measured, but carried unexpected weight. Charlotte explained that while she believed protocol must be respected and consequences must follow when it was breached, she also believed in the possibility of redemption and growth. She spoke of how the monarchy itself had evolved over centuries, adapting to changing times while maintaining its core values. She suggested that perhaps this situation could become an opportunity, not just for punishment, but for education and genuine change. The tribunal members listened carefully, their expressions revealing surprise at Charlotte's relatively compassionate stance. She wasn't asking for leniency exactly, but she was clearly indicating that she didn't want to see Camilla's life destroyed over this incident. It was a remarkable display of maturity and mercy, especially considering the nature of the offense committed against her. After Charlotte finished her testimony and left the room, the tribunal took a recess to deliberate. Camilla and Mr. Harrison were asked to wait in an adjacent chamber. The minutes stretched into hours, each one feeling like an eternity. Mr. Harrison tried to reassure her, suggesting that Charlotte's testimony might work in her favor, but Camilla remained uncertain. She had seen the tribunal members' faces, the seriousness with which they viewed the situation. Charlotte's compassion was admirable, but the tribunal might decide that setting a strong precedent was more important than individual mercy. During the wait, Camilla found herself thinking about Charlotte in a new light. The young woman she had resented and dismissed had just demonstrated more grace and nobility than Camilla had shown in years. Charlotte could have pushed for maximum punishment, could have used this opportunity to eliminate someone she might have viewed as a rival or threat. Instead, she had shown restraint and even a degree of kindness. The contrast between Charlotte's behavior and her own made Camilla feel even more ashamed of her actions. Finally, they were called back into the tribunal room. Lord Pembridge looked grave as he began to speak, outlining the tribunal's findings. They had determined that Camilla's actions constituted a serious breach of protocol and conduct. The disrespect shown to the future queen could not be overlooked or treated lightly, as doing so would undermine the very foundations upon which the royal household operated. Camilla's heart sank as she listened, preparing herself for the worst. But then Lord Pembridge continued, and his words took an unexpected turn. While the tribunal found her actions serious enough to warrant significant consequences, they had taken into account several mitigating factors. Her complete acknowledgement of wrongdoing, her lack of any prior similar incidents, and, notably, the testimony and wishes of the future queen herself had all been considered. The tribunal's decision was multifaceted. Camilla would be stripped of certain privileges and titles she had held, though not all of them. She would be barred from attending official royal functions for a period of 1 year, effectively removing her from the public eye and the circles she had once moved through freely. Additionally, she would be required to undertake a program of education regarding royal protocol and conduct, to ensure such a lapse never occurred again. But the most significant element of her punishment is what the tribunal called confined service. For 6 months, Camilla would be assigned to work in royal charitable organizations, specifically those that served underprivileged communities. She would live in modest accommodations provided by these charities and would work directly with the people they served. She would have limited contact with her former social circles and would be monitored throughout this period to ensure compliance. It was, in essence, a form of imprisonment, though not behind traditional bars. She would lose her freedom, her comfortable lifestyle, and her status for half a year. But it was also an opportunity, a chance to reconnect with the true purpose of royal service that she had lost sight of somewhere along the way. The tribunal made clear that if she failed to complete this sentence satisfactorily, more severe consequences would follow, possibly including permanent removal from any association with the royal household.
Lord.
A primer?
I find it on with it.
I'm to sip. The tribunal hoped that Camilla would emerge from this experience as a better person, one who truly understood the weight of responsibility that came with any connection to the crown. If she could do that, there might be a path back to some form of royal service in the future, though that would depend entirely on her conduct, growth during her period of confined service. Camilla listened to it all in a state of numb shock. It was better than she had feared in some ways, but worse in others. The idea of leaving behind everything familiar, of working in conditions she had never experienced, filled her with dread. Yet underneath that fear was something else, a tiny spark of hope. This wasn't the end of everything. It was harsh, humbling, and would undoubtedly be difficult, but it was survivable. More than that, it was potentially transformative if she allowed it to be. When the proceedings concluded, Mr. Harrison congratulated her quietly on what he termed a relatively favorable outcome given the circumstances. But Camilla barely heard him. Her mind was already racing ahead, trying to imagine what the next 6 months would hold. She had 1 week to settle her affairs before reporting to the first charitable organization, where she would begin her service. As she left Buckingham Palace that afternoon, Camilla passed through the same grand corridors she had walked a week earlier. But everything felt different now. The palace that had once represented power and prestige now represented something more complex: duty, sacrifice, and the weight of tradition that could both protect and punish those who moved within its sphere. Outside, London continued its busy rhythm, unaware of the personal drama that had just concluded within the palace walls. Camilla stood for a moment on the steps, breathing in the cool air and trying to process everything that had happened. She had been given a second chance. Though it came wrapped in consequences, she would spend the next half-year experiencing firsthand. The royal guard who had initially approached her after her outburst at Charlotte stood nearby, his duty complete. He had acted swiftly, as was his obligation, setting in motion the events that had brought her to this moment. Now he simply nodded respectfully as she passed, a gesture that somehow carried both acknowledgement of what had transpired and a silent hope for her eventual redemption. Weak Camilla had to prepare for her confined service. Passed in a blur of activity and emotion, she spent her days settling practical matters, arranging for her residence to be maintained in her absence, and handling financial affairs that couldn't wait 6 months. But the nights were reserved for a different kind of preparation, one that involved confronting the person she had become and imagining who she might be when this ordeal ended. Her first assignment was to a homeless shelter in East London, far from the elegant neighborhoods she was accustomed to. When Camilla arrived with her single permitted suitcase, she was met by Mrs. Patterson, a sturdy woman in her 60s who ran the shelter with an iron will, wrapped in genuine compassion. Mrs. Patterson looked Camilla up and down with an expression that suggested she had heard all about her new volunteer, but wasn't particularly impressed by royal connections or past status. The accommodation Camilla was shown to was a small room barely large enough for a single bed, a narrow wardrobe, and a small desk. It was clean but sparse, a stark contrast to the comfortable surroundings she had always taken for granted. The bathroom was shared with other staff members, and the heating was temperamental at best. This would be her home for the next 2 months before she rotated to her next assignment. The work began immediately. Camilla was given duties that required no special skills: serving meals, cleaning common areas, sorting donations, and helping with basic administrative tasks. Mrs. Patterson made clear that she expected Camilla to work the same hours and carry the same load as any other volunteer, with no special treatment or accommodations for her background. Those first days were brutally difficult. Camilla's body ached from physical labor she wasn't accustomed to. She had never realized how exhausting it was to stand for hours serving food, or how her back would protest after bending to mop floors and organize storage areas. The other volunteers and staff members kept their distance initially, unsure how to relate to someone whose fall from grace had been so public and dramatic. But something unexpected began to happen as the days turned into weeks. The people who came to the shelter for help started to break through the walls Camilla had built around herself. She met Sarah, a young mother of two who had fled an abusive relationship and was trying to rebuild her life from nothing. She met Thomas, an elderly veteran whose pension wasn't enough to cover both rent and food, forcing him to choose between shelter and meals. She met countless others, each with their own story of hardship, loss, and the daily struggle to survive. These weren't abstract statistics or distant problems to discuss at charity galas. These were real people with names and faces, hopes and fears, dignity, despite their circumstances. Camilla found herself genuinely caring about what happened to them. She looked forward to seeing Sarah's children smile when they came in from school. She worried about Thomas's persistent cough and made sure he got the warmest blankets available. She celebrated small victories with the shelter residents and mourned setbacks alongside them. The transformation wasn't immediate or dramatic, but rather a gradual shift in perspective that occurred so naturally, Camilla almost didn't notice it happening. She stopped thinking about what she had lost and started appreciating what she was gaining: understanding, empathy, and a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with status or recognition. Mrs. Patterson noticed the change too. The woman who had arrived 6 weeks earlier, carrying herself with barely concealed resentment and entitlement, was slowly being replaced by someone more genuine and present. One evening, after the dinner service had concluded and the shelter had settled into its nightly routine, Mrs. Patterson sat down with Camilla over tea. The older woman didn't offer praise exactly. She acknowledged that Camilla was putting in real effort and seemed to be taking the experience seriously. She also shared something that surprised Camilla. Mrs. Patterson had known about her situation from the beginning, but had chosen to give her a genuine chance rather than treating her as either a criminal or a celebrity. She had simply treated her as someone who had work to do, and Camilla had risen to meet those expectations. After 2 months at the shelter, Camilla was transferred to her second assignment, a community center in a working class. It's a neighborhood that provided after-school programs for children and support services for families. The director, an energetic woman named Amara, immediately put Camilla to work helping with homework clubs and organizing activities for the kids. Working with children brought its own challenges and rewards. Camilla had never spent much time around young people before, and their energy and honesty were both exhausting and refreshing. They didn't care about her past or her mistakes. They cared about whether she would help them with their math homework, whether she would play football with them in the yard, whether she would listen when they wanted to talk about their day. One little girl named Lucy became particularly attached to Camilla. Lucy's mother worked multiple jobs to support the family. The child craved adult attention and affection that was often in short supply. She would seek Camilla out as soon as she arrived at the center each day, eager to share her drawings or tell stories about school. Camilla found herself looking forward to these interactions, touched by the simple trust this child placed in her. It was through Lucy that Camilla learned one of her most important lessons during this period. One afternoon, Lucy was upset because she hadn't been chosen for a school play, crying that it wasn't fair because she had practiced so hard. Camilla found herself explaining that sometimes we don't get what we think we deserve, that life can be unfair, but that how we respond to disappointment defines us more than the disappointment itself. As she spoke these words to comfort a child, Camilla heard her own lesson reflected back at her. She had spent so much energy being angry about what she felt she deserved, about the recognition and status she thought should have been hers, but Charlotte had never owed her anything. The crown and the respect it commanded belonged to those who earned it through service and sacrifice. not to those who simply wanted it for themselves. The months continued to pass, each assignment bringing new lessons and perspectives. Her third placement was at a care facility for elderly people with limited financial resources. Here she learned patience as she helped residents with basic daily tasks. Listened to their stories from long lives, and witnessed both the dignity and vulnerability of aging. She saw how quickly circumstances could change, how people who had once been successful and independent could find themselves dependent on the kindness of strangers. Her final assignment brought her to a youth rehabilitation center, working with teenagers who had made serious mistakes and were trying to turn their lives around. This placement felt particularly relevant to her own situation. She saw herself reflected in these young people, their struggles with pride, their battles against self-destructive impulses, their desperate desire for second chances. One teenager named Marcus reminded her especially of herself. He was intelligent and articulate, but carried anger that sometimes exploded in destructive ways. Camilla spent hours talking with Marcus about his goals and fears, and in helping him understand his own behavior patterns, she gained deeper insight into her own. They were not so different. She and this troubled youth both had let their worst impulses control them at critical moments, and both were now trying to find their way back from those mistakes. Throughout these 6 months, Camilla had minimal contact with her former life. She received occasional letters from Mr. Harrison, updating her on various legal and financial matters. But otherwise, she was cut off from the royal circles she had once inhabited. At first, this isolation had felt like punishment. Gradually, however, she came to appreciate it as a gift. Without the distractions and temptations of her old life, she could focus entirely on this journey of transformation. She thought often about Charlotte during this time. The future Queen's mercy had made this opportunity possible, and Camilla wanted desperately to prove worthy of that grace. She wondered if Charlotte knew how her testimony at the tribunal had affected the outcome, if she understood that her willingness to speak for redemption, rather than revenge, had literally changed the course of Camilla's life. As the 6 months drew to a close, Camilla was required to write a report on her experience, reflecting on what she had learned and how she had changed. She sat at the small desk in her final temporary accommodation, a room at the youth center, and tried to put into words a transformation that felt too profound for simple language.